And we're live,
Yes.
I hope.
Yes.
Welcome to Worldwide Neuro. Welcome to the NeuroTheory Forum. My name is Tim Vogels. I'm a professor at the Institute of Science and Technology in Klosterneuburg, Austria. I have recently switched and just started my job here, and we're doing this theory series in collaboration with Andrew Sachs and the NeuroTheory Forum at the University of Oxford. And before I introduce today's speaker, who is the first speaker after a long summer break, I would just like to remind you of the features you by now are very well aware of: a chat box on your right-hand side, a question button in the bottom, and you can use both of these at your leisure to ask questions of the more lighthearted as well as the more complex kind throughout the talk. If there's anything that I should interrupt Kenji for, I will do that, but usually we wait until the end of the talk to then ask questions. If you don't want to be invited on screen for your question, please mark your question with off screen. Otherwise, I'll try to invite you onto the screen to get a conversation going. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce to you Kenji Doya. Kenji probably worked on reinforcement learning before it was called reinforcement learning. He got his PhD at the University of Tokyo in 1991 in mathematical engineering and became a research associate or a postdoc at the University of San Diego in 1991, the same year, and then quickly returned to go back to Japan in 1994, where he started as a fellow at the Advanced Telecommunications Research International Institute in Kyoto, and where he became the head of the Computational Neurobiology Department in 2003. In 2004, he then switched over to Okinawa and became a professor there, and established both a summer school as well as a graduate program at the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology, which is actually a sister institute, I learned, of the OIST Austria. Kenji's gotten many awards. I think the coolest of those awards, or the coolest sounding of these awards, is the Donald Hebb Award in 2018. And Kenji continues to be interested in understanding the functions of basal ganglia and cortical circuits. And today he will talk about what we can still learn from the brain to make artificial intelligence more intelligent, I guess. So without further ado, Kenji, I give you the floor. Thank you very much for coming today.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Tim, for the kind introduction, and also for the entire forum organizer for picking me for this talk. Right, so let me turn on my screen. Okay. Hope you can see my PowerPoint screen. All right, so the title is What Can We Further Learn from the Brain for Artificial Intelligence? Right. Okay, so first of all, do you know where is Okinawa? Okinawa is here.
I do.
So
hold on, I think you focus your screen very quickly there. Yeah, this is better. Okay, go ahead.
Right. Yeah. So it is like a southern west end of Japan. It's like a 2.5 hour flight from Tokyo, but actually it's conveniently traveled from many other cities in East Asia. So we would like to attract people, not only tourists, but scientists and students to our new institute. So just as Tim told, so we are like in a so-called bridge network of new, like a interdisciplinary, relatively small graduate university. Like currently, these 5 are our partners. So I really look forward to the opportunity to actually physically visit OIST Austria in the near future. Right. Okay. So, my lab at OIST is called Neural Computation unit. So because it was the first lab to be built in OIST, we tried to make it a kind of interdisciplinary lab on its own. So in one side, we are interested in creating autonomous adaptive system, and also want to understand the brain's mechanism for learning. So we do like machine learning and robotics experiments, and also neurobiology experiments using mice and rats. So as we are working on both sides of AI and brain science, so many people ask, what's the relationship between AI and brain science? So, and some people say that to make intelligent machines by electronics, maybe we don't need to bother the biological constraints. But some other people say that because there's already a very nice implementation like a brain, so why don't we reverse engineer that successful example, right? So the history is swung back and forth between these two extremes. For example, in the previous century, the AI was coding human expertise and knowledge. But more recently, AI is learning from big data. And in doing that, brain-like implementation like deep learning gave a very good performance. So more and more people are thinking that maybe something to learn from the brain. For example, in pattern recognition, the important finding was that Hewitt and Weave's work showing that our visual cortex is a collection of many kinds of feature detectors. And then the Rosenblatt showed that by combining those features, you can create a learning pattern recognition machine. And also the biologists showed that such feature detectors are not fixed, but learned through experience. And then theoreticians came up with an algorithm for multi-layer learning, for example, neocognitron by Fukushima. And then in such a hierarchical network, you expect to find a very high-level feature in the higher layers. And indeed, biologists found higher-level feature representation like a place cell or face cell, right? And more recently, the AI researchers did deep learning to a large data set from the internet, and kind of found the like a face cell in the upper layer of the deep neural network. So I think there was a very important interaction between neurobiology and the progress of artificial intelligence. So myself work in the field of action learning in the form of reinforcement learning. So in this topic, the origin was in the psychology, like a classical conditioning or operant conditioning. So in those studies, it was made apparent that the prediction of the future reward plays a very important role in animal learning. And based on such a, inspired by such a concept, the modern theory of reinforcement learning was created by the Paavo, Sutton, and colleagues. So in which this critic that predicts the future reward play a very important role in learning. And then actually on the neuroscience side, the Wolfram Schultz found that dopamine neurons encode reward prediction error. And also my current colleague at OIST, Jeff Wickens, found that neurons synapses in the basal ganglia have a specific type of plasticity called dopamine-dependent synaptic plasticity. So this kind of observation promoted people to propose the reinforcement learning model of the cortico-basal ganglia circuit, right? And then based on such a hypothesis, people studied the function of the dopamine basal ganglia system in more detail. And for example, our collaborators found the kind of action value like a representation in the basal ganglia. And more recently, this learning of action value was used for like a deep Q network for the program to play different kinds of computer games. So again, in this domain of reinforcement learning, a very constructive interaction and simulation between neuroscientists and AI researchers. So then what else can we learn from the brain for the artificial intelligence tomorrow and the future? So that was the main topic we proposed for our 5-year project, Japan's Kakenhi program called Corresponding and Fusion of Artificial Intelligence and Brain Science. So when we started this one, we ran the kind of a brainstorming workshop with the people at the Gatsby and the DeepMind in London. So one of the topic was what we can learn from the brain. And yeah, so this is the paper by the people at the DeepMind. So they also raised the deep learning and reinforcement learning was past a few successful cases. So it is very nice review about what is going on currently and what is important in the future. Right? So this is my version of the slide. So probably the 3 important domains where we should learn from the brain for the artificial intelligence in the future. One is the kind of energy efficiency. So today's deep learning, a lot depends on GPU. And if you have a GPU machine on your desk side, you would know how hot and noisy they can become. Compared to our brain, which is supposed to consume just 20 watts of energy. And even more important topic would be kind of data efficiency. So deep learning works well when you have a lot of data, but humans appear to be able to learn from much fewer experience. Why that is possible? How can we mimic that in artificial intelligence? That is a very important topic. And also autonomy and sociality. So how to build artificial intelligence which is can think on its own and understand the expectation from others. So that would be a very important direction AI should further learn from brain. So the first kind of energy efficiency is not really my area of research, but recently many scientists and the industry developing chips dedicated for running convolutional neural networks or mimicking spiking neural network. So for more efficient computation. So why our brain can perform high power computation with low energy consumption? So in the digital computers, robustness is achieved at element level, like bistable elements and the synchronous operation. And if you want to do a stochastic operation, we use a deterministic pseudo-random number generation. Right? So that and also the data and the computation software are segregated, so which can induce like a communication loss. So on the other hand, in the neural computing, so even though that device level, they may be not so rigid, but somehow the robustness is achieved in the systems level. And also the memory and the computation are locally integrated. So that would be the possible reason for the efficient computation of the brain, but we still don't clearly understand its design and operation principle. And if we better understand these principles, probably we can design more efficient high performance computers. So I think that's a very important direction we should learn, not only AI, but more general computation from the brain. Okay, So next, kind of data efficiency. So this DeepQ network was quite phenomenal. The people at DeepMind found out the reliable way to combine TD learning and deep learning. So using memory replay and also separation of the target network and the learning network. So it became a stable, but at the cost of data required and the computation required. So, and then some people, like this paper by Lake and colleagues, pointed out that compared to the slow learning curve of the DeepQ network, some of the games human can learn after very short practice, perform a very good, achieve a very good performance. Right? So they asked, what is the reason for such data efficient learning by humans? So we already have some kind of model of how the world works, and they are based on like intuitive physics and intuitive psychology, and also we can utilize the past experience by decomposing the modules for new situation, and also each modules can be can learn more efficiently after learning, something like learning to learn. So I also agree that these are very important features of our brain realizing data efficient learning. Right. So in reinforcement learning, there's a model-free and model-based strategies. So in the model-free case, the agent doesn't have any prior knowledge about the environment or task, and learn from the sequence of state action reward and state action reward, and learn the action value function or state value function. So the algorithm is really simple, but often takes a lot of trials for learning. So there's a model-based strategy in which the agent already knows or learns the internal model of the world. By taking a certain action in a certain state, what will be the next state? And to get the reward, in which state, with what action you should take. So if you already have such a knowledge, you can do a simulation in the brain without actual physical experience. So we can plan appropriate sequence of actions. And also, this kind of state transition model is very helpful under noisy sensory observation to supplement the poor current sensory input with the prediction from the past. So, model-based strategy allow us to flexibly adapt to the environment, but internal computation can be heavy. So how we should combine simple model-free strategy and the more elaborate model-based strategy, a very important issue. And also how such a model-based process is implemented in our brain is also a very important topic of brain science. For example, in AI field, already 30 years ago, Rich Sutton demonstrated that instead of always working with the real world, working with the world model, learning can be very much accelerated. So this is a work by my PhD student, Paavo, so of bouncing up and balance this smartphone robot. So initially it takes such a random movement, but it gathers the data and build an internal model of how the body responds to the wheel movement in the form of the Gaussian process. And then use such an internal model to compute, optimize the motor controller. And then after less than 10 trials, this robot could learn such a bounce and balance behavior. So this is one demonstration of the data efficiency of a model-based strategy. So I think in model-based strategy is a very important component for human intelligence. So we can define the mental simulation as the brain's process using action-dependent state transition model. So S prime equal FSA, this is a kind of deterministic version. More generally, this can be a action-dependent state transition transition probability. Right? So we can use such internal model from the past state and action to estimate the current state. It is very helpful in a noisy environment. And we can apply such a prediction model to the current state to predict what will be the best action or action sequence. And you can apply such a model to kind of arbitrary imaginary state for something like a thought experiments. And our use of language is also dependent on such a use of the imagination of the scene from the language. And also building a scientific theory requires a lot of thought experiments in the initial stage. So this is a very important component of our intelligence, and how such state of transition model is acquired and used in the brain. That's a very fascinating topic. So today's computers are very good at simulation once the equation is built. But we somehow construct a model from our interaction with the environment. So the mechanism of the mental simulation by the brain should also be helpful for building an AI agent, which can adapt to many different new environments. So regarding the implementation of mental simulation, possibly interesting hypothesis is that different parts of the brain are specialized for different kinds of learning. For example, cerebellum for supervised learning, which will be helpful for learning a deterministic model of the body and the environment. And the basal ganglia is specialized for reinforcement learning based on the scalar reward signal, which will be helpful for evaluating the predicted action and states. And cerebral cortex would be specialized for unsupervised representation learning, which will be helpful for providing the basis for working memory of a different action and the states. Right? So, for example, the simple model-free action selection could be realized by connecting the state and action representation in the cortex with the action value function learned in the basal ganglia. So model-based framework is a bit complicated, but this forward model prediction from the previous state action to the next state, it can be learned from a sensory experience. So through supervised learning. So then several lines of study suggest that cerebellum has such a forward model to predict a new state. Then for the current state, somewhere in the brain come up with the action candidate, and then the forward model predicts the resulting state, and the state value function of the basal ganglia evaluates the goodness of such a state, and if that is good enough, you execute that action, otherwise come up with another candidate. So this is a little bit complicated, but theoretically that would be possible. And once you find out that this is a good action take for a given state, you don't need to repeat the same computation again and again. You just can memorize this state action mapping. That is also a subject of supervised learning. So maybe some other part of the cerebellum may be involved in memorizing state to action mapping in a kind of a habitual behavior. So, and we performed a kind of functional MRI study to test such a hypothesis. We asked the subject to play like a computer game of moving this cursor from start position to the goal position. But to make this game interesting, we limited the movement of the cursor to only 3 out of 8 neighborhoods by pressing one of the 3 buttons. So we pre-trained subject for this key map or action-dependent state transition model, and then presented a new target. And then before subjects started to move fingers, we gave some delay period. And then the subject benefited from such a delay period using based on kind of mental simulation utilizing pre-learned action-dependent state transition model. And during that time, we found elevated activity in the parietal cortex, premotor cortex, and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And in addition, some part of the cerebellum and the anterior basal ganglia, which are connected with these cortical areas. So this is like a consistent with the hypothesis that working memory in the cortex and forward model in the cerebellum, and also evaluation mechanism in the basal ganglia would be involved in mental simulation for action planning. So we are hoping to implement some kind of neural decoding study to further clarify the particular functions these areas are performing for mental simulation. And we are also interested in the mechanism of mental simulation at the cellular level. For example, the people like Dave Reddish and the Foster showed that when they decode the place cell activities, when the animal stops and thinks where to go, the decoded position moves deviate from the current position. So they suggested that this is a kind of a neural correlates of mental simulation by the rats and the mice. So, but we wanted to show some more stronger evidence that certain neural activities are involved in prediction of the either future state or current state using action-dependent state transition model. And this is the kind of a behavioral paradigm. So the mouse is head fixed under the two-photon microscope and on this air-floated ball. And then we gave auditory feedback. So sound is initially from the small volume from the front speaker, and the mouse goes forward. It comes from the side in a higher volume. It approximates this running on the linear track to reach the target where the mouse can get sugar water. And we also implemented the condition when the sound feedback is omitted in certain segment of this linear track. So this situation is something like a popular beach game. You cannot see your target by your eyes, but utilizing how many steps you have made, and also sound from the surrounding, intermittent sound, you can estimate the target position and then get the reward. And this is the mouse's behavioral data. We changed the initial distance randomly, but it's sorted by the initial distance. And as they walk close to the target, they start the anticipatory licking. So this licking increased almost exponentially toward the target. So this shows that the animals were not just running on the track, but estimating the target distance to the target, and then stop and lick. So, and then this happened even when we turned off the sound feedback, suggesting that mice use the kind of action-dependent internal model to estimate the goal distance. But when we injected muscimol to the parietal cortex, so behavior were all the same with the sound feedback. And when we turned off the sound feedback, the increase of the licking disappeared. So this suggests that for this action-dependent state inference, the circuit of the posterior parietal cortex plays an important role. And then we performed the two-photon imaging of the posterior parietal cortex and the adjacent multisensory areas in the mouse brain. So with this two-photon microscope, we could observe the activities of layer 2, 3, and down to layer 5 neurons. So we could observe several hundred neurons in each session. And this is a summary of thousands of neurons my former postdoc Aki recorded. Some of the neurons had distance tuning to the target. Some of them have a kind of ramping, increasing activities. Some of them have the activity during the reward consumption phase. So this is for the layer 2, layer 3, and layer 5. So we initially expected quite a large difference between superficial layer and deeper layers, but the difference was more subtle than we initially anticipated. But we could perform like a decoding paradigm for this data set. From the neurons with clear distance tuning, we identified the tuning curve, and from the instantaneous record of the activity, by combining this likelihood from different neurons, we can compute the posterior distribution these neurons would encode in the framework of a probabilistic population coding. And as the animal moves close to the target, this posterior distribution also moves close to the target. And that happened even when the sound feedback was omitted. So this neural activity in the posterior parietal cortex was updated using action-dependent internal model. And when the sound feedback turned on, this posterior distribution became much sharper. So this is something which would expect for something like a dynamic Bayesian inference, right? Yeah, so this is the neural dynamic Bayesian inference decoded by Bayesian paradigm. So it's a bit confusing, but it suggests that cortical population are involved in probabilistic inference using action-dependent state transition model. And such a change in the variance of the posterior was more clearly seen in the deep layer neurons, like layer 5. Okay. So now we are gradually understanding the mechanism of mental simulation, and then how we would combine the model-free and model-based strategies. But the big question is that how these kind of models and policies learned in the separate part of the brain are activated and connected as needed. So when we do like a functional MRI study, we assume that the brain areas that are responsible for certain computations are activated. And then we write papers based on such a hypothesis. But we really don't know why such appropriated modules are activated and connected appropriately. So that's still a very big question in neuroscience. And also today's AI, there are many useful programs are built, for example, for face recognition or speech recognition or language translation. But those AI programs should be connected appropriately. Currently, human experts do that, but ideally, those appropriate learned modules should be combined on the fly as needed. So how such a flexible combination of modules are realized is a very important topic for AI, autonomous AI agents as well. So, there are interesting topic of module selection and connection, both in the computational level and also biophysical level. Right? For example, the Wolfart and Kawato propose a framework called Mosaic Architecture, which uses a prediction error as the basis for module selection. And we extended that idea to like a Bellman error for the model-based reinforcement learning controller. And Peter Dayan, Nathaniel Do and colleagues proposed that uncertainty may also be the important factor in the combining modules. Yeah, so there are different ideas which we should further explore. And also the biophysical mechanism for module selection and connection is also very important. For example, the Zhao Jinwan and colleagues proposed that the different kinds of inhibitory neurons in the cortical circuit are used for like input gating or output gating, which is a very interesting proposal, in addition to the use of different rhythms for the connection of the different modules. So this is a kind of domain in which the progress in the neuroscience and projects in the machine learning theory should be well combined. Okay, and this is three major components in reinforcement learning: like prediction, action selection, and learning. So how to implement these steps are important, but also how to tune these parameters, like a temporal discounting for the how long into the future you take into account, and also the temperature parameter for the exploration and exploitation, and the learning rate parameter for the speed of update of your memory. So from our experience in machine learning and robotics application, we know that these parameters should be well matched to the task requirement. And our brain can adapt to many different environments and tasks, suggesting that there should be some kind of automatic tuning mechanism for these parameters, which can be one form of meta-learning. So regarding that, yeah, so important setting temporal discounting factor, right? This battery pack by camera, and then go to the battery pack for charging more efficiently as the experience goes on. So this robot can see this battery pack, but doesn't want to go approach it unless it is seen very close. If it is further than certain distance, he is not very interested. So we wondered why this robot is so depressed. But yeah, what was happening is that this temporal discounting parameter was set very small. So in that case, long future wait for the long future reward was almost zero. So if you have to spend certain energy, so this is total evaluation can be negative. So that's what was happening. And then in regarding the tuning of these meta-parameters, we came up with a hypothesis that acetylcholine, noradrenaline, serotonin may be respectively involved in tuning different hyperparameters of the reinforcement learning. So among these hypotheses, we have been focusing on the role of serotonin in the brain. So we started with the chemical measurement in a delayed reward task, and we verified that the serotonin release is elevated when the animal is engaged in the delayed reward task. And if we use the pharmacology to reduce the serotonin, they made more errors in waiting in a long time. And as we recorded the serotonin neural activities, we actually found that when the animal is waiting for the delayed reward at the reward site, serotonin activity is elevated. And when the animal gives up waiting, so serotonin neuron activities go down shortly before animal give up and walk away from the reward site. And more recently, we can use the optogenetics framework. So this mouse is a transgenic mouse which expresses the channel lobes in serotonin neurons. By blue light, we can turn on the stimulation, and by yellow light, we can stop stimulation. So he goes back and forth with this tone site and real site, and then he waits for the food pellet, either 3 seconds, 6 seconds, 9 seconds, or infinity. And this infinity or omission trial, he usually waits like 12 seconds, but as we stimulate the serotonin by blue light, he could wait much longer. Right? So serotonin stimulation makes the animal more patient, which is consistent with the hypothesis that the serotonin controls the temporal discounting parameter. But we recently found that the story is not so simple. So if we introduce omission trial, once in 4 trials, the serotonin stimulation takes a large effect. But if we give a reward only once in 4 trials, the effect of serotonin stimulation goes away, even if we increase the amount of reward to equate the value. And also, as we change the reward timing varied, so effect of serotonin stimulation is more pronounced. So these features are not easy to explain just by simple model-free temporal discounting model framework. So then to explain this kind of features, we came up with a new model, new framework, in which the mouse has an internal model for reward timing, and then the likelihood for the trial to be rewarding comes down as he waits longer and longer. And this likelihood is combined with the prior belief about the reward to give the posterior probability for the reward, and then animal decides when to abandon, depending on this drop of the posterior probability. Right. And then in this case, our hypothesis is that the serotonin may be involved in the control of the prior belief for this trial to be rewarded. And so when the timing is uncertain, this drop-off of the likelihood is more gradual. So for which the same increase of the prior probability of the reward trial gives a larger effect for the timing of abandonment. That is like a somewhat extended model about the function of the serotonin in the framework of model-based decision making. All right. So this way, so the several factors of data efficiency. I today explained about our own effort, but there are a lot of studies going on, which is relevant for understanding the data efficient mechanism of the brain. And finally, so autonomy. So when we started to talk about changing the temporal discounting factor, some people criticized that by changing the temporal discounting parameter, you are tweaking the objective function. So how can we evaluate the learning? So, and also what is the origin of the reward and the evaluation is a very important higher level question about reinforcement learning. So, and then we ended up with building a robot like this, so which realizes a self-preservation for catching batteries and self-reproduction by exchanging programs through IR communication. So this is something like a survival and reproduction in artificial agents. So they explore in the environment and catch the battery pack for the survival. And after well charged, they look for a mating partner. And then when they face each other, they can use communication to copy the program. Well, we usually have the same program, and they copy the key parameters of reinforcement learning. So each hardware robots have multiple software agents. They can come to life in a time-sharing manner. They have weight parameters for the innate behaviors, and also the weights parameter for the reward function, and the parameters for the reinforcement learning as the genes. And they exchange the gene, and then the probability of the use of the gene is affected by how well charged each robot is. And then this way we could implement the distributed the evolution of the reward function and parameters of reinforcement learning. For example, this is the supplementary reward for finding a battery pack in the view. Initially, it was almost flat, but as through the evolution, when the battery is seen in the center and the closer, this visual reward is higher. And for the view of the face of other robot, because transmission is easier at a certain distance, different profile of a reward was acquired through evolution. Yeah, we could also see that the parameters of reinforcement learning, like a temperature or landing rate or temporal discounting factors, are optimized for a given environment. And also, sometimes we found unexpected behavior, like heterogeneity of behavior in the same colony. So when the robots finds a battery pack and another robot, decision is fair to go for eating or go for mating. Some of them always go to the battery pack. Some of them look for a mating opportunity by keeping track of the another robot. And my former postdoc, Stefan, did a gene analysis of these robots and actually found the bimodal distribution of their genes. The major difference was in bias for mating behavior. These red guys start mating even when they are less than half charged, but the green guys perform mating only when they are fully charged for sure use of their genes. Right? And he could even found that these two types can stably coexist at a certain mixture. Right? So by combining the reinforcement learning and the evolutionary framework, we could let robots find out their own reward function, and also some kind of like a heterogeneity or polymorphism can be observed. And in addition to those rewards linked to survival and reproduction, humans and animals have some curiosity which guides our like exploration in a directed way. So there's a lot of studies going on how we can implement something like a curiosity in reinforcement learning agents. So both, I don't have time to go through all these, both model-free and model-based framework. There can be several candidates for the computational correlates of curiosity. That's the very actively studied area in artificial intelligence, motivated from the observation from the human animal behaviors. Okay, so then as the AI agent can find their own reward function and then acquire the behavior to satisfy it, that can be great for the AI agent that can create scientific discovery, create new technology or culture or industry. But also we have to be careful about the potential danger of such autonomous agents. So there can be some kind of a runaway or side effects. And also more immediate danger would be exploitation by individuals or groups or governments who has ambition or hatred. So, and then managing the danger of such AI agent, probably there are many things we can learn from the human societies, because humans are the most dangerous species on Earth. So we have brought many species to extinction already, and human species came to near extinction through the World War and also nuclear races. But we somehow kept our species going. And then from many failures in history, we learned to the ways to manage such dangers. Democracy is one of the way to avoid the concentration of unlimited power to a small number of people or group. In the politics, the election term limits or separation power has been implemented. And also in the economy, anti-monopoly or right to strike and the information disclosure has been implemented in the modern society. So, and then probably this kind of mechanism to avoid the concentration power would be important in the future society, where the many AI agents would cooperate to support our society. And probably the peer reviewing among the open source AI agent would be a basis for the secure, reliable AI society. And probably in doing that, there should be something to learn from our brain, which is the basis for our human society. For example, how the prefrontal cortex and amygdala interact in social orientation. I don't have time to go through all details, but there's interesting research going on in neuroscience. All right, yeah, so some of those points are summarized in a recent position paper in the special issue of artificial intelligence in the current opinion in the behavioral sciences last year. Okay, so I thank you. I would like to thank for all our collaborators, and also would like to make an announcement. So next month, we are inviting the leading researchers in both AI and brain science to hold this online symposium, October 10th to 12th. The online registration is still open. And also in 2 years, we are hosting Japan's Neuroscience, Neurochemistry, and Neural Network Society Joint Conference in Okinawa. And hope in 2 years you are free to travel around, and hope many of you have a chance to come visit Okinawa. Okay, thank you very much for your attention and patience.
Well, thank you, Kenji. Thank you very much. Right now, we only have one question so far. Actually, I was going to ask the same thing. Why is it that you're using robots for your experiments? Would it not be easier to just simulate?
So of course, we do not only do robot experiments, usually combine robot experiments and simulation. Simulation has a lot of degrees of freedom, and then by parallel processing, more experience than a single robot. But if you only do simulation, you are tempted to tweak the problem easier for you to demonstrate your point. If you use a robotic hardware, you have to really tune your learning and optimization mechanism for the given problem. And also that gives a better physical intuition. So simulations are useful, and if you are really clever, you can do everything by simulation. But by doing the robotics experiment, at least sometime you can verify whether you found out in the simulation really applies to the real environment, and it can be a more stringent test of the framework you have proposed using simulation.
Slight switch of topic. When you're proposing a function for serotonin, for example, do you propose that as a function? I mean, obviously, serotonin has other functions in other brain regions.
Right. Yeah. Right.
How do you think that comes about? Do you think that the different brain regions learn to use a specific neurotransmitter or modulator for a specific function, or is this like the conflict when you have two different functions for the same neuromodulator, or when you just have, activity for that neurotransmitter? Sorry, this is slightly.
Yeah. So that's a good point. So, for example, the serotonin has many different receptors. Some are kind of excitatory, some are inhibitory. So how can serotonin have a single message? That is an obvious question. But my way of thinking is that serotonin from the dorsal raphe or median raphe may be some kind of a global message, like the interest rate have changed, or the exchange rate between euro and yen has changed. So for such a message, depending on your position in the society, for example, if you are in the exporting industry or importing industry, your reaction should be totally different. So that's why the serotonin needed many different kinds of receptors. That is my way of thinking. So it may be true, it may be wrong, but I think there's a need for the global messaging for the brain to perform in a coherent way. Then the temporal discounting could be one aspect of the signal serotonin carries. But probably its message is more general. One potential domain is like how much time available either for action or learning. Right? So if you have more time, so for example, you can use sophisticated model-based planning. But if you don't have time, you have to take a reactive quick response. And if you have time, you can do more exploration. So how much time available would be a very important parameter to affect your behavior. So my current speculation is that serotonin would be involved in such a available time that needs to be tested. One interesting observation is that in many animals, serotonin level is highest in the morning and gradually come down toward the evening when there's no time for exploration anymore. So yeah, so it is not simple, but I'm hoping to come up with a more coherent framework as possible.
All right. We have a few more questions. There's a few people coming on screen, but they're still connecting. So I'll read one of the questions by Alejandro. What do you think is the actual role of dopamine in the embodied reinforcement learning? I guess there's a second question, but I'll let you answer this one first.
Yeah, so in the basal ganglia, so dopamine-dependent synaptic plasticity is well established. So they would be used for the reward prediction, probably in the form of a state value or action value. But dopamine projects also for the cortex, where its role in working memory is well known. And also there's evidence showing that cortical dopamine affects representation learning by combining the certain sensory stimuli, like auditory stimulus, with the dopamine stimulation. Tonoptical map is shifted. So I think in addition to the basic mechanism of dopamine based TDLR like learning in the basal ganglia, it would be also used for like a weighted representation learning in the cortex or control of the working memory in other areas.
So the follow-up question to this would then be how different action selection mechanisms, motivational, basal, etc., are combined in a modular view of the brain.
Yeah. So my initial view was that striatum is involved in like a state and action value function representation. And the subsequent areas like a pallidum would be used for stochastic action selection. But actually, so we see a value-like representation not only in the striatum, but also pallidum and the cortex as well. And also we see some action-like representation in the striatum also either. So it is not the purely stage-wise processing of the value to selection and implementation. It appears that the entire cortical basal ganglia circuit has some kind of a attractor dynamics. So striatum would be strongly involved in the value component, but cortical-cortical connection would give some kind of a like a prior predisposition or weight for certain actions. Right. So, and then the simple model-free component from the basal ganglia might be combined with a more elaborate model-based component coming from the cortical processing. So, rather than just one part of the brain taking control of action selection or decision making, there would be some kind of attractor dynamics or like agreement achieved by the connected circuit of the brain, linking the cortex and the basal ganglia and even the cerebellum would be used for action selection. Yeah, so that kind of view is also proposed by the Paul Chisek. So I agree on that kind of view of more global dynamics for action selection.
Kenji, the people that were going to come online are having trouble connecting, so I'll just read their questions.
Yeah.
Anastasia Christakou is asking, or is commenting that it would be interesting to hear more on thoughts of linking sub-agent insights, for example, perceptual DM, single neurotransmitter process, to agent-level perspectives, for example, curiosity, intertemporal decision-making, and so on.
Could you repeat the first part of the comment?
So so she would like to hear your thoughts on linking sub-agent insights, so single neurotransmitter processes, etc., to agent-level perspective, so curiosity, intertemporal decision-making. In other words, how do you connect mechanistic processes to sort of more human-like qualities? And I have a follow-up question for that too.
Yeah, so I tend to think in like a reinforcement learning paradigm. So there should be a component for like a state and action representation, and a component for value computation, and then even a component for action-dependent state prediction. And also for all those to work, there should be good enough like working memory capability. So and then the different parts like cortex, basal ganglia, and the cerebrum would be take different roles, and then the excitatory and infinitory transmitters are used for the particular computation for the value computation or the sensory motor representation. Yeah, so I tend to start from an abstract construction model, but actually want to understand how they are realized in actual population of neurons and connection by different neurotransmitters. Yeah, so it's not easy, but yeah, so it's worth trying. Actually, in one of my subgroup is working on more data-driven construction of the spiking neural network. So currently, those detailed network models and the conceptual behavior models are not quite combined, but I'm hoping to bring them together in the near future, hopefully. Yeah.
Do you think you can use sort of one-to-one mapping of the different functions of the neurotransmitters onto your system to explain or to get complex behavior? Or trying to paraphrase a question that was
right. Yeah. Yeah. My simplest idea was that serotonin for discounting and noradrenaline for exploration and acetylcholine for memory update. There are some experimental observations consistent with those simple view, but there are many others which is not so simple, simply explained by such a view. And also, when we change, for example, the temporal discounting parameter, we should also change the exploration parameter and learning rate parameter. So those setting or parameters are related with each other. So they, even if they have a specific function, they have to be regulated in a coordinated manner. Just changing one parameter alone doesn't work well. So we expect a lot of kind of a crosstalk or interaction between those systems. Yeah.
All right. Going to the dangers of AI section at the end of your talk, I was wondering when you talk about groups having hatred or ambition, you were talking about human groups, right?
Yeah. Right.
Talking about the AI itself developing an emotion.
Yeah, so that's the interesting question. So do they have to have a kind of a hatred or ambition over humans? Yeah, that's I cannot immediately think of a good reason for that, but that currently there's no proof that cannot happen. So that kind of possibility should also be taken into account.
In other words, do you think emotions are a byproduct of serotonin, of like a neurotransmitter use? So, for example, like in reverse, if we're treating depression by blocking serotonin reuptake, for example, is the depression that people feel simply a byproduct of the system working properly, or is it the actual presence of that neurotransmitter? And then in extension, if we build machines with the electronic parallel of a neurotransmitter, will they immediately have emotion as a byproduct of possessing the electronic or the virtual parallel of serotonin?
Yeah, so if those agents become more autonomous and then monitoring the situation and then become able to control the action policy or even learning parameters, maybe that would be similar to what we observe as emotion. So depending on the situation and also the link with the healthy operation of the system, try to control its parameter. Some of them may appear to us as like emotion.
So, question by Venkat Ramaswamy was: do you think it's easier to determine if an AI agent is malicious than to determine than to solve the problem of understanding AI agents in general? In that the principles.
Yes, so that's probably as difficult as whether a person is a really good guy or a bad guy pretending to be a good guy. So until you actually experience that it was a bad guy, the guy appears as a good guy. So, but in the case of AI agents, so if we insist on like disclosing the source code, we have a better understanding than the humans, for which we cannot look into the brain. Right? But even if the source code is open, the functioning of the AI agent depends on what kind of data they are trained on. So in such a case, to verify the safety of the agent, we may need to do some kind of a audit to give a certain signal or look into a certain representation, whether this agent is honestly making a response or hiding something behind. Right? Yeah. So if the future AI agent will be powerful, dependent enough to affect our life, so such like a monitoring and audit of the AI program would be kind of something important. Right? Yeah. So building a perfect machine is very difficult. Also in the human society, nobody is perfect. So people make mistakes, and people sometimes is addicted with certain thoughts or ideas. But somehow by like a peer reviewing and monitoring, criticizing each other, we avoid people, or at least minimize the people doing really bad things. So something similar, like reviewing each other, would be necessary for the AI agents, even when in some cases they may do something bad.
Yeah. With that, maybe we'll close the questions. It's already well past 11 o'clock at night where you're at.
Right.
It's a long day. So thank you very much again, Kenji. I'll see you on the Zoom link afterwards for a quick debrief. But for now, thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you very much for all the questions and also the people who had the individual meetings with me. So I enjoyed this kind of virtual tour of Oxford and IST. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Cheers.
Yeah. Right.
Have a good evening. Goodbye.
Yeah. Good day.